But I'm so grateful to everyone who is just joining us this morning. I'm so grateful to our speakers who are here to join us this morning. It's early in the morning, but let's go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome. This forum is being organized by the Neighborhood Council Sustainability Alliance. If you would like to introduce yourself, please feel free, everyone who's here, to put your name and affiliation or your local neighborhood council in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'll just tell you a little bit about the Neighborhood Council Sustainability Alliance. We are an alliance of 64 member neighborhood councils. And our mission is to advance sustainability and resilience across the city of Los Angeles through advocacy, sharing of best practices, and community action. And if your neighborhood council is not yet a part of our alliance, we invite you to come and join us. So I think I'm going to skip some of the introductory stuff today and just get straight to the panel. So our panel is called Getting to 100% Clean Renewable Energy ASAP. How will this transition change your life? And how can neighborhood councils help? So I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today. Our speakers, if you can just wave when I say your name. Sammy Roth covers the energy beat for LA Times. Thank you so much for being with us today, Sammy. Ashkan Nassiri is one of the leads on the 100% renewable energy study at LADWP. Thank you for being with us, Ashkan. Alex Jassett is from Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles, and he's also representing the Repower LA and the LEAP coalitions here. Thank you so much for being here, Alex. And Dr. Fred Pickle is the ratepayer advocate for the city of Los Angeles. Thank you so much for being with us, Fred. Thank you. Okay, let's just go straight in. So Sammy Roth, can you kick us off, please? Can you sort of frame this 100% renewables, the study, the action that's been taken at City Council? Where have we come from? Where are we now? And where are we going?
Sure. Thanks, Lorraine. I'm happy to do that. Just seeing the names of people in here, it seems like a lot of folks who are probably pretty knowledgeable about some of this. So I'll try to keep it brief and not belabor a lot of things that folks already know. In a lot of ways, LA has a pretty clean power supply, or at least is on its way to 100%. If you look at the mix for, the most recent year that there's data, about a third of it is renewable, mostly solar and wind and geothermal. If you add in hydropower and nuclear, which we could certainly have, arguments and discussion about, but, carbon-free resources, that gets you over 50% of the way to what the state law requires, 100%. The really tricky thing is that the single largest power source for the city is still this big coal plant, Intermountain, up in Utah, which is about a fifth of the city's power. And frankly, that's the last, coal that's really a significant part of the power supply for the whole state of California. So LA's got some work to do there. The coal plant is supposed to shut down in 2025. There's a plan that DWP has right now to build a natural gas plant in its place, which is still a fossil fuel. There's an effort that's being made to, transition that gas plant to hydrogen by 2045, which, in theory would be a clean burning fuel and a way to make that transition away from coal while still kind of having gas as a bridge. There's debate around that and discussion. It's not yet clear if that's going to work. It's sort of a first of its kind type project, but it's interesting. The other big thing is that here in the LA basin, we've got 4 gas burning power plants, 3 along the coast, Scattergood Harbor and Haines, that are supposed to shut down by the end of this decade. Still, DWP working on figuring out how to replace those. And then the big one is really the Valley Generating Station up in Sylmar, which is sort of a real workhorse, and also had an issue last couple of years with a gas leak that went unreported by DWP, methane leaking from that facility for a pretty significant amount of time and not getting reported, which folks in the communities there were not happy about, understandably, when that came out. So gas is about a quarter of the power supply. So those are the big things the city needs to figure out. Lorraine mentioned the study. National Renewable Energy Laboratory, big federally funded research institute, spent several years working with DWP and with community stakeholders on, this really exhaustive look. Can the city get to 100%? By when? Is it going to have major economic disruption? Is it technically feasible? And this was sort of a first of its kind thing. And this study came out earlier this year, and the finding was, yes, it's feasible. No, there's not going to be, real significant economic disruption from this to the point that people would notice. And not only that, but it's possible to get, almost all the way to 100% if you wanted to by about 2030, and that you could get the whole way there by 2035, which would be 10 years ahead of what's mandated by the state right now, which is 2045. So that was a hopeful study in terms of how things look. The study also found that there'd be really, really significant adoption of rooftop solar and distributed energy to help get to that. I think I'm forgetting the number offhand, but I think at least in terms of single family homes, the study assumes something like 40% of people for whom rooftop solar would be economic would have that. So that was significant. And so the city council followed up on that study by sort of following Mayor Garcetti's call for 2035 and passing a resolution endorsing that goal. So that's where we're at right now. Some big lifting still to be done, but some signs that it's potentially doable ahead of schedule.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sammy. So we're looking at 2035. So Ashkan, can you tell us what is that going to mean for LADWP? What is this transition from now in 2035 going to look like? And what in particular are the most challenging obstacles for DWP to be able to accomplish this? Are we going to be able to keep the lights on?
Thank you, Lorraine, for the introduction, and thank you, Sammy, for painting a good picture of what we are talking about here. To give some context and add to what Sammy said, LA 100 was a 3.5-year study that concluded March of this year with the goal of determining what investment should be made to achieve 100% renewable energy portfolio for DWP. And also, I'd like to mention that this study didn't stop there. The impact of transitioning to 100% on jobs and economic development, along with benefit of GHG reduction and air quality improvement, especially for environmental justice neighborhoods, were also analyzed. LA 100 looked at several paths for achieving 100% carbon-free power system for the city of LA, with compliance year of as early as 2035, which is the topic of today's discussion, and up to 2045, and indicated that a 100% carbon-free power system by 2035 is possible through one of its 4 main scenarios called early and no biofuel. The LA 100 study found no matter what path we choose, there are common investment among all scenarios which we studied to get to 80 to 90% renewable. And that's where we are going from now until 2030 and beyond, investing in the power system to transition to 100% renewable energy. Regarding the challenging obstacle, I like to put that in different buckets, what we foresee. As far as procurement of renewable resources, 100% carbon-free by 2035 requires continuous and momentous build rate of renewable resources, energy storage, transmission, build out, and distributed energy resources, the rooftop solar and beyond the meter energy storage that Sammy alluded to. LA 100 identified the need for well over 4,300 megawatt of wind, 5,700 megawatt of solar, and 2,600 megawatt of energy storage. To put this rather large number into perspective, Elan Solar Energy Storage Project in Mojave, California, which I believe most of you guys are familiar with, is the largest power purchase agreement that DWP signed about a year and a half ago, and will come online in the first quarter of 2023. Is 400 megawatt of solar generation and with 300 megawatt of energy storage. And comparing that to the 5,700 megawatt needed solar resource, it means we need about 15 of these solar projects to meet our solar procurement goal. So, and as more utility in the US start transitioning to 100%, we will be competing for the same resource, whether it's trained workforce, solar, wind resource, or energy storage. Uh, Another bucket would be, okay, we generated all this power. As we accelerate the procurement of renewable resources, we must ensure having an adequate transmission system to bring all that renewable energy to the city, which requires significant amount of transmission upgrades and new buildouts. Traditionally, the California Environmental Quality Act, known as CEQA process, has been lengthy and major delay for building projects, especially transmission lines. Having to wait 3 years or more to complete an environmental impact report for one transmission project is not conducive to our goals. To date, we have identified, I think, well over 12 transmission upgrades that needs to be completed. Another perspective of these obstacles would be our distribution system. One of the main assumptions in LA 100 study was that started with a clean slate and assumed that all distribution work in progress, such as feeder overload, transformer overloads, or mitigations were completed before adding all the new load from building and transportation electrification, which could potentially double our peak and annual energy demand. To put that in perspective, we have well over 160 distribution stations and over 1,600 feeders that run through the streets of LA, and they will need some sort of upgrades. Another very important bucket for, I think, everybody here would be system reliability. Phasing all these new resources, taking outage and shutting down transmission line, distribution stations to upgrade, to do the upgrade requires a systematic planning, as DWP needs to maintain adequate resources and multiple level of backups through the power system to ensure system reliability. And also, we are working with limited number of months in a year. We cannot take outage in August through October when our load is close to the peak. So we are, give and take, we are working with about 8 months in 1 year. As Sammy mentioned again, hydrogen at IPP. Speaking of system reliability, LA 100 studies stress the critical need for in-basin form of dispatchable capacity in order to support system reliability during major loss of transmission lines or extreme events, such as wildfire, something that we have seen recently. As a result, LA 100 suggested or recommended building approximately 2,200 megawatts of green hydrogen capacity in basin between 2031 to 2035, which relies on maturity and rapid deployment of green hydrogen in LA in order to achieve the last 10% carbon free, which is rather the most challenging and expensive part. So we have to build all this stuff. This type of rapid build rate and upgrade requires a large workforce. Having a trained workforce and resources to rebuild the power system and be able to maintain this very decentralized power system. This is in contrast to what we have had in the past, 40 years or so. Decentralized power system in the future would be another factor. In the coming years, we will be competing for resources and trained workforce as Los Angeles gets ready to host the 2028 Summer Olympics, in addition to competing with other utilities and other sectors. And above all, we need to keep our rates reasonable and low. LA 100 study showed that some of the biggest gains in greenhouse gas reduction or GHG reduction and air quality improvement comes from electrification of other sectors, such as transportation, in addition to the power sector. This study indicated that 100% carbon-free can be cost-effective. However, it relies on significant growth in load, which most likely comes from transportation electrification, to spread the fixed cost and keep the rates low for our customers. So affordable electric rates will play a big role in decarbonizing our environment and is a key to success as the city transition to 100% carbon free. And at the end, I know that some of you guys been involved. DWP launched its 2022 Strategic Long-Term Resource Plan. We call it SLTRP on Thursday, which will examine some of the challenges that I mentioned, along with other risk factors such as supply chain impact, uh, procurement, implementation, and feasibility of these projects in the coming months.
Great, thank you, Ashkan. I really appreciate that summary. Okay, so Dr. Fred Pickle, so we heard about some of these obstacles to DWP. I heard, we have to build large projects rapidly and scale up quickly. Gonna need some grid upgrades, and I heard that permitting is gonna be a challenge. All of these things, or some of these things, have costs associated with them, and I know that your office did an analysis of the costs and the impacts to everyday bill payers, such as most of the folks in this Zoom call. So tell us, what are the impacts going to be on the ordinary bill payers, and what did your analysis find in terms of what is most cost effective?
I wanted to emphasize a couple points that Ashkan made. One, the carbon in 1990 emitted by DWP was almost 18 million metric tons a year. Right now, we're at about 12.8 million metric tons a year, and with bringing the IPP coal generation offline, that will take us into the range of 1 to 4 million metric tons a year. And so the key focus really ought to be making sure we get past generating with coal at IPP. The second step in this is we're talking about percentage renewables a lot, but I think we really should be talking about GHG. And this takes some data from the NREL study. And on the left side is a chart looking at the SBA moderate load pathway. And it shows the 12.8 million metric tons for power, but it also shows the emissions in the building and transportation sector. And then if we look at a high load case, and the emissions for the high load on the chart on the right are shown by that red line that says moderate load. And you see that in high load, the total emissions in 2035 and 2045 are lower than the moderate load, but the carbon emissions from the power sector are higher, helping achieve and serve that load. So I think it's important for us to focus on the total goal of GHG reduction. And then this is true for other emissions as well. If you look at PM 2.5, the little black line along the horizontal axis is PM 2.5 emissions by the power sector, and all the other emissions changes are really driven by primarily vehicle emissions, and to a lesser degree building emissions, in terms of how we might be able to reduce things. Now, how does this translate into rate changes? In the long run, the LA 100 studies, as evaluated by DWP's financial service organization, gave rate increases in the long run roughly equal to or even less than expected 2.5% inflation. But you see in the short run, over the next 5 to 15 years, a lot of those scenarios, a lot of those pathways studied had significantly faster increases in rates. And a lot of the higher increases in rates shown here are reflective of the low load scenario. So electrification, because you're selling more power, or you're dividing your fixed costs along greater power sales, you have a lower rate impact. So the key message is electrification of transportation and buildings not only improves GHG, but it also makes things more affordable to customers. And one of the challenges with long-term forecasting like this is you have to make a lot of assumptions, even for the additional scenarios. But really, there's not so much certainty in the world. If you look at the left-hand chart just shows a series of projections of energy sales and peak by DWP over the last 15 to 20 years. And you notice they're always forecasting up, but the actual sales and peaks have been low and going lower. So there is a lot of risk associated with where we may end up on energy sales. And as a little chart on the right shows, the uncertainty in sales has as much of a cost impact as the difference between the LA 100 scenarios, the pathways on, for example, SB 100 and no biofuels. Another big uncertainty is the cost estimates for resources. If you've seen me talk before, I've presented this particular slide on the right many times. It shows price expectations for various technologies in 2009, and it shows you the actual in 2019. I expect, given the amount of R&D activity, we may have other, hopefully good surprises, but not entirely good surprises. Nuclear has been an even bigger problem than shown in this chart. This shows costs in 2009 at below 150. I saw estimates of $150 a megawatt hour. And I would be surprised if the one nuclear plant being built in the US right now doesn't come in at far in excess of $400 a megawatt hour. And then I can't get my forwards and backwards straight. There's the question of how quickly will people adopt these new technologies. On the far left is a look at various technologies and their adoption in the US over a long period of time. On the right-hand side of that chart, it shows various projections on the penetration of electric vehicles. The two scenarios used in the LA 100 study are relatively modest. If we end up with growth rates at the higher growth rates, Ashcan would have a very busy life for helping enhance the distribution system. And then another point Ashcan made is procuring the renewables for this period. This chart on the far right shows the percentage of renewables in the total portfolio, and it shows a very severe ramp up even by 2025. So we'll have to change the way we do a lot of things to accomplish goals like that. So what's my point? First of all, DWP is committed and working hard to eliminate that last coal generation. I think going forward, we need to look at the whole package of major GHG emitters in order to balance those as we try to reduce the total. And LADWP system needs to be strengthened and stay flexible to manage higher levels of clean resources, evolving and uncertain levels of electricity use, and avoid early commitment to technology whose cost and performance changes may be very large over the next 1 to 2 decades. I think we will all have a challenging time. although I like to be a skeptical optimist on all of this.
All right, thank you very much, Fred. Great. So we have a lot of uncertainties, but there's also some really interesting findings there. In particular, that focusing on things like building electrification and transportation electrification actually makes all of this cheaper for everybody. So that goes into some of your work, Alex. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your work with this study. You are here representing the LEAP Coalition and the Repower LA coalitions, which are coalitions of environmental, labor, and community groups. And I would love to hear how you are working to make sure that this transition is a just transition, and what what you're working on to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, good morning, everyone. And I just want to say a quick thank you to the NCSA for inviting me to be here today. And thanks to everyone for getting up early on a Saturday morning to join us. So the LEAP and Repower coalitions know that this transition needs to happen. And we've been working to make sure that it will happen. But how it happens is just as important to a lot of the communities that we represent. So we see the city's overall climate strategy as an opportunity to not only reduce carbon emissions, but also to reduce inequity, particularly around building decarbonization, which is where our focus is at the moment. And so our coalition is working with housing, labor, and environmental justice organizations to develop an energy justice framework that can help guide the city's transition to a zero carbon future. And we're looking forward to moving that ahead in the weeks to come. We often hear people say, at this point in the climate emergency isn't doing anything better than nothing. And our response to that is that climate policies that don't include diverse voices at the decision-making table up front will never be as successful as those that do. So it's important to at least get that step right. And I'll give you a quick example to illustrate that point. So well-meaning climate activists pushed for solar panel subsidies to increase renewable energy production, which is great. We love solar panels. But they said, let's start with the low-hanging fruit. We'll take the path of least resistance. We'll support commercial and industrial buildings and single-family homes, which meant that all of the benefits of early adoption went to businesses and wealthier people that could afford to own their own homes and afford the upfront costs. And in return, those people got cheaper installation and electricity costs and long-term financial savings. And if you couple that with an electric car or a fleet, which you also could have gotten subsidies for, then you're also getting savings on your transportation costs and cleaner air in your neighborhood. And when this is aggregated in certain communities and not in other communities, it exacerbates the existing pollution problems rather than helping to break them down. And unfortunately, if you're a renter or you can't afford a new car, you are basically left out of the equation. So, we're trying to figure out how can we include things like no upfront cost or fixed rates, which can be helpful for low-income communities and other vulnerable communities, and make sure that all of these benefits are easier to access because that way they'll be more likely to be adopted. And if the ultimate goal is to reduce carbon rapidly, then we need to make sure that the solutions are accessible to everyone. And if we're going to design accessible and successful policies, we need to have diverse voices at the decision-making table. And that includes Indigenous communities, Black and Brown, and low-income communities, as well as housing, labor, and environmental justice representatives. So our goal with the LA 100 and the city's building decarbonization strategy is to make sure that the processes that are used to determine those policies are equitable and inclusive. And just because we know that those will lead to better outcomes. And so the good news is that the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office was set up specifically to incorporate community input into the city's climate policy. The mayor's office is currently working to seat the Climate Emergency Commission, which will provide another pathway for community and expert input into this process, and also provide a level of oversight. And there will also be community assemblies put on by the CEMO that I hope many of you will participate in. I think those will be scheduled later this year or early next year. And those community assemblies will be opportunities where people can ask questions, make suggestions for new policy, and provide some of the real world data and ground truthing that is often left out of climate policy. And so if we're successful, the transition will not only reduce carbon emissions and other pollutants, but it will also create well-paying jobs in frontline and vulnerable communities. It will improve the grid and neighborhood resilience. It will create new and support existing affordable housing, reduce energy costs and utility debt, and it will foster a culture of democratic policy co-design within the city. And we also want to avoid false solutions like nuclear and carbon capture and sequestration, and potentially even green hydrogen, which could be used as a lifeline to support the fossil fuel industry if it's not dealt with appropriately. So in short, what we aim to do is to decarbonize, detoxify, and democratize the city of Los Angeles. And we're looking forward to working with all of you towards that end. So I think that's a good place to stop for now.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate those answers. Okay, so I have lots of other questions for our panelists, but I want to make sure that we get to our audience questions. There's lots of questions in the chat here, but maybe as we're answering these questions, you could sort of frame your answers in terms of what it means for LA to lead the world in this work, because I think the whole world really is watching what's happening here in LA. So the first question I see in the chat is from Ravi. At what percent renewable will DWP be by the end of 2021? And then with near-term projects to which you have line of sight. Can we get maybe just a quick answer to that from Ashkan?
Sure. I don't remember the exact number, but we are very close to be over 40%. I don't have the actual number. And that percentage can change really depending on how much load we have every year. So.
Great. Okay. So from Andrea, what is the status for rebates to electric appliances like induction stoves and variable speed heat pumps, including upgrading electrical panels for older homes and apartment buildings? SoCalGas keeps giving rebates for dirty appliances, and there are no rebates for electric appliances, making them more expensive and harder to afford. This really gets to that information about building electrification and how it helps everybody. So we should be supporting people to put in electric appliances. Alex, would you, or who would like to start?
Yeah, DWP.
Yeah, that's a great question, but I can get back to you with an answer. I don't have that handy here. I can share that with the NCAAs and they can forward the answer to you.
Thank you.
Can I pop in for 1 second here?
Please, yes.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have a question for the answer to the question about when DWP, if they're going to do that. But one thing that I've written about that some folks here might be familiar with and others might not be, as of this week, there are now 50 cities or county governments in Los Angeles, and Encinitas down in San Diego County was the 50th this week, that have approved policies either requiring or strongly encouraging or incentivizing new construction to be all electric. So, no gas heating and gas cooktops, but rather, electric heat pumps, induction stoves, etc. So that's becoming a more popular policy. It's something that's been discussed in Los Angeles, but has not happened as of this point. I've asked various city council members and the mayor about it, and there's some support for the idea, but I'm not sure if there. Clearly it seems there hasn't been enough support for that to get it through the city council at this time. So something that's actively happening elsewhere, but hasn't happened here.
Thank you. Okay, and I'll read some more of the questions from the chat in a little bit, but Chris Rowe has her hand up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm an environmentalist, and I tried to put on solar on my house about 15 years ago when I found out it's not really feasible for my home. I have this nightmare scenario when we're talking about, say, for example, shutting down Aliso Canyon. Well, I realize the risks involved of keeping it open. I look at our homes. I look at my home. I've calculated what it would take for me to convert to take out my furnace, which would require me taking out my air conditioning, my hot water heater, gas hot water heater, my brand new gas dryer and my gas stove that's not that old. So maybe 20,000 plus any retrofitting. But I see a graveyard. If we have, a couple million people in Los Angeles, I don't know how many DWP has. And so we take all these appliances offline to put in all electric. Number one, we have to have a place, and say, for example, my new dryer and washer are smart. So they're using precious metals, and there are things in there that could be harmful to the environment, and also were used for like our computers and things. But my concern is how much energy are we going to be using to create the all electric appliances that we need to replace every one of these appliances. Plus, let me just finish the sentence, Lorraine, 1 second. We also know, like I live in a 2-story house, you have to clean if you have rooftop solar, you have to maintain it. And it would be very dangerous for someone to go up on my roof to maintain it. So I just would like someone from DWP to speak to my concerns about what's going to happen to all the appliances in this future scenario. Thank you.
Thank you. So who would like to respond to that first?
I can go first. So one of the assumptions that LA 100 had was a natural adoption of electrified appliances. So I believe in the moderate case, we assume that people will change as time comes, and they're going to replace their appliances because of different rules and regulations. The gas burning appliances won't be available. So they are basically forced to buy electric. And if that's the case, it's going to take a number of years, probably 30 years or so, depending when the Title 24 goes in effect or is already in effect. But when the sales of gas appliances are stopped, that's a natural adoption. And what happens to those? Probably is going to be a lot of recycling. Probably going to see a ramp up in recycling businesses, as there are a lot of precious metal, as you mentioned. There are probably steel, copper, aluminum. There are so many things that hopefully we can recycle and reuse in building future appliances.
Thank
Thank you.
I add to that?
Yes, please.
The LA 100 study looked at the costs of serving electric load for increased electrification and transportation, but it didn't look at the cost benefit of what to push first and how fast to push it on both electrification of vehicles and buildings. And the sense is vehicle electrification will probably occur quicker because there's a shorter life cycle to vehicles than there is to most major appliances. But that analysis really hasn't been done. It's a piece of public policy homework we need to do the cost benefit of what we need to do first. And another part of that cost benefit is what sort of incentives should DWP and the other utilities offer towards to help move toward electric vehicles, and what is the appropriate incentive to be on the electric ratepayers versus covered other ways. So that's work in front of us on the policy front.
Thank you. The next question in the chat, speaking of green hydrogen, how are you planning on sourcing it?
Okay, so LA 100, what we looked at, we know that we need a lot of renewable resources. And there are many hours in a year that we don't have that level of load. So that we either have to curtail or store it somehow. So the main driver for the green hydrogen would come from otherwise curtailed renewable energy, wind and solar resources. And by basically using electrolyzer, we can create hydrogen and keep that hydrogen and store that hydrogen and use it when we need it. And that's basically the idea behind the seasonal mismatch. So we produce the energy or the fuel that we need when the load is not high, but we have a lot of renewable resources. Time forward when it comes to August, September, October, or if there's a contingency and fire or something that we need to turn down and shut down transmission lines, that's when we can reuse the hydrogen to create the power that we need. So it's our DWP plan is to have 100% green hydrogen.
Thank you. So there was this NRDC UCLA study about 3 or more years ago showing that 4% of private buildings in the city use 50% of the electricity. One of our questioners would love to hear a response about that and what should be done about that.
I don't know the exact study that they're talking about, but I can jump in a little bit about that. So I think that that's a very very good point. We have to look at who is actually using the bulk of the electricity and the energy in this city, because I think one of the myths that the fossil fuel industry uses is that it's all on us. It's our fault. We should have conserved more. We should have been shutting our lights off every time we leave the room. We should be shutting off the faucet as we're brushing our teeth. But all of those savings don't really add up to anything compared to a very efficient industrial building, or taking a fossil fuel plant offline would have a much greater impact than all of us shutting off the lights every time we walk out of the room. So I think combating that sort of myth that it's on the consumer, it's the consumer's fault for the climate crisis, I think is kind of backwards. And so what we're hoping to do is to really dig into who's using the electricity, who's using this energy, figure out ways to make that consumption much more efficient, first of all, because efficiency will make everything else that we do so much easier. And if people are not being good neighbors, are polluting, are creating conditions that are unsafe for their neighborhood, then those are the kinds of things that we want to work to close or to transition. And we think that that's part of this energy justice framework. It's not just looking at carbon emissions, for example. It's also looking at things like green hydrogen. What are the nitrous oxide implications for that? Because I believe there's still significant nitrous oxide emissions locally when you burn green hydrogen, even if it's sourced from renewable energy. And also, what are the land use impacts of that? Are there explosive tanks in people's neighborhoods all of a sudden? So these are the questions that are much deeper than just the CO2 equation. And that's what we're really trying to work on incorporating into these policies.
Thank you. Alex in the chat has a question. I'm also curious about whether we are considering having decentralized solar over our residential streets. Ashkan, do you want to take that one?
So LA 100 looked at the technical prospect of having solar on rooftops, on parking structures, on parking canopies. We haven't looked at having solar panels over the streets, if I understood the question correctly. That's not something that we have looked at. So
there have been experimental installations of solar sidewalks in some areas, but I don't know anything about the underlying economics of those results.
And I have heard of solar pavements, very small pilot project, but I think the efficiency was so low that they shut down the project and did not pursue that further.
Thank you. Lois asks in the chat, what are the plans for streamlining the permitting process for transition from gas to electric in old multifamily buildings? Right now, it appears there's a 6-month lead time required, and I believe that's from your personal experience, Lois.
Yes, indeed. That is from our personal experience.
In trying to transition a multifamily building. Yes. So are there any plans for, pushing for improved permitting?
Louis, I assume permitting in regards to DWP to get new electric lines, or?
Yeah, up the amperage, and yeah, I think the city has to, increase the amperage. I think we had 150 and we had to go to 400, and then be able to have electric appliances in all of our apartments. So that all had to be engineered and then gone through probably multi-stages of the permitting process with building and safety and planning and DWP, and seemed like it was a nightmare. And in the meantime, our 100-year-old gas infrastructure crashed, and we had no cooking facilities, and rushed out to buy some single burner induction countertops, and pay people a per diem food budget and so forth like that. But so we ultimately reinstalled our gas infrastructure, which was slightly embarrassing for an eco village.
Yeah, Lewis, so as you alluded to, that equation is twofold. DWP is part of that equation, and then basically everything inside, past the panel and the meter, it really becomes Building and Safety, Department of Building and Safety, DBS. So for the first half, basically you apply to the new business at DWP. And I believe that we have a backlog at this time. And from what I'm hearing, it can take a couple months to several months at this point. As far as having one program that homeowners can apply to, and it takes you through the DWP process and DBS process, I think that's something that's a great idea that we should be looking at to see where DWP and DBS can come together and create one-stop shop for LA residents.
Thank you. Well, we have a hard stop at 9 a.m. because the mayor is going to be addressing the Congress of Neighborhoods at 9 a.m. So we do need to wrap up. I want to thank all of our speakers. We're so grateful for the information that you brought today. This has been a really informative session. And just on that last point regarding transitioning of buildings, I want to mention two things that NCSA is working on. One is the Cool Blocks program, which is support if you would like to organize your city block, that your neighbors, to transition over to electric appliances and do several other things like improve your disaster preparedness, etc. We have a support program for that and we're getting funding for it. So please sign up for that. Lisa's going to put that information in the chat. And then our next NCSA general meeting is on Sunday, October 10th at 6:30 p.m. We'll be doing some neighborhood council advocacy training. So please join us for those and for further programming. And I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers. Can we all give a hearty thank you and a round of applause or gratitude to our speakers? Thank you so much for being here today.
Well done.